Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to continue talking about the Articles of Confederation and the time period that surrounds them. We're going to start off by talking about government under the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided a government for the Western Territory based on Thomas Jefferson's ideas. At first, the Congress would appoint a territorial government led by a governor, secretary, and 3 judges. The citizens would enjoy freedom of religion, trial by jury, and the rights of common law, including habeas corpus. Once a territory had 5,000 men, the territory could establish an elected assembly, but the governor remained an absolute veto over its laws. When the population of a territory reached 60,000, the people could request admission to the Union as a state on equal terms with the original 13 states, provided the new state adopted a Republican constitution. The Midwestern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota were later formed out of the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 also barred slavery from the territory, which meant that the 5 new states would enter the Union as free states rather than as slave states. This federal restriction set a precedent that would later alarm people in southern states who wanted to expand slavery throughout the territories. Now, this decision right here, we are going to see come back into play whenever we are talking about things that lead to the Civil War. By adopting the Northwest Ordinances, the Congress discarded the British model of keeping colonies in permanent subordination. The Congress designed the territories to attract American settlers and to assure their acceptance of federal rule. In the wake of the Revolution, few Americans would settle where they could not enjoy basic freedoms, including the right to elect those who would set their taxes. So, yeah, you have to think here, these people just fought a war for freedom to elect their leaders, to set their own laws and things like that, and then they have the option to live in a place where they don't get any of those things. So they may have had family members fight and die in this war, and now they don't get those things that they fought for. No, we're not going to live there. So that is why these territories often did not have a huge population. But freedom and opportunity for Americans came at the expense of the region's 100,000 American Indians, who were expected to give up their lands and relocate elsewhere. During the mid-1780s, American Indians resisted, and the federal government lacked the means to defeat them. After the Revolution, Congress had insufficient funds to support the army, so it was reduced to only 350 men who could barely defend themselves, much less conquer the Northwest Territory. So this territory is not going to be super attractive. Sorry about that, guys. Let me roll it back here. So this territory is not going to be super attractive to these settlers because it's overrun with the Native Americans who are trying to defend it as their rightful territory. And they're not able to rely on the military to protect them simply because Congress does not have enough money to pay for a military. So these territories are not going to be attractive for settlers. During the mid-1780s, the Spanish and the British did not take the United States seriously. To them, the Republican Confederation seemed weak to the point of anarchy or lawlessness. So the Spanish and the British are not taking the United States seriously. The British probably thought that, give them a few years, they'll come crawling back. The closure of New Orleans. The Spanish had always been wary of American independence, and they distrusted American expansion westward because they feared it threatened their colonies of Louisiana and Mexico. To discourage settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Spanish forbade American trade with New Orleans. American settlers expected to ship their produce down the Mississippi River to market in Spanish-held New Orleans. The Congress lost support from Western settlers when it almost accepted the closure of New Orleans in return for commercial agreements to benefit Northeastern merchants. George Washington observed, "The Western settlers stand, as it were, upon a pivot. The touch of a feather would turn them any way." So, George Washington is afraid he's going to lose these people. They want to sell their goods in the markets of New Orleans, but they're not able to due to this agreement. And the United States strikes a deal that benefits the northeastern merchants, but it doesn't really do anything for the Southerners or the Westerners. So George Washington is afraid he's going to lose these people. The location of New Orleans at the junction of the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico has made the city a key commercial hub for centuries, and it's still a major city today. Disputes with Britain. Relations with the British Empire were also strained. In the peace treaty that ended the American Revolution in 1783, the British had tried to cultivate American goodwill. A year later, the British abandoned that policy in favor of making the Americans pay for their independence. Rejecting the new doctrine of free trade championed by Adam Smith, the British renewed their traditional mercantilism as defined by the Navigation Acts. So, at first the British were trying to play nice with the Americans to try to make them an ally, and then they just decided, you know what, let's just show these people who's boss. So they are going to be very difficult to deal with. This meant that Americans could only trade with the British Empire under rules that favored British interests. That would certainly import all of the British manufactures that they wanted, but they could no longer freely send their ships to trade with the British West Indies, the most important market for American fish, lumber, and grains. During the 1780s, the British reserved this valuable trade for their ships to benefit their merchants. They alone could carry the American produce needed by West Indian consumers. This restriction especially hurt Massachusetts, which had more ships than any other state and a greater need for the West Indian market for its fish and lumber. In retaliation, Massachusetts prohibited British ships from transporting its exports. But this retaliation did not work because the other states did not support Massachusetts. In addition, the Congress was too weak to coordinate a common front against Britain's mercantile policy. American merchants began to call for a stronger national government. So we're seeing here another weakness of the government under the Articles of Confederation. Massachusetts acted on its own and tried to make some sort of arrangement with a foreign country. That was something that could be done under the Articles of Confederation, but if Massachusetts tried that same thing today, it would be considered unconstitutional because a state cannot make a deal with a foreign country. The British Empire also embarrassed the Confederation by keeping frontier forts on the American side of the boundary set by the peace treaty. To please the American Indians, the British kept their forts at Niagara, Detroit, and Michilimackinac. I got that wrong. Let's move on. For justification, the British cited American violations of the peace treaty. Contrary to the spirit of the treaty, some states had blocked attempts by British merchants to collect debts and attempts by loyalists to reclaim their confiscated properties. The Congress could not make the states honor the treaty. So here's another weakness showing up. Britain's hold on the forts angered Americans, but they could do nothing because they could not afford to raise and keep an army. Like the merchants, many settlers wanted to build a national government strong enough to compel British respect on the frontier. So, just another weakness showing up that under this, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress could not afford to keep an army up. So whenever the British military just stayed around and didn't leave, there was nothing they could really do about it. The fledgling government under the Articles of Confederation found itself facing a host of difficulties. It soon became clear to many that the Articles themselves were part of the problem. So people are starting to figure out why their government is so weak. Okay, so let's look at a list of weaknesses here. The first one says Congress could not levy or collect taxes. So the way that Congress got money is they just asked for it. They asked for donations from the states. And you can look it up if you want. But under this system, the federal government was never once adequately funded. The second one says Congress was powerless to regulate interstate commerce and foreign trade. Each state had only one vote in Congress regardless of its size. So, Virginia was the biggest state at the time, and it had equal representation to Rhode Island, which was the smallest. And that's not right. A 2/3 majority, 9 out of 13 states, was required to pass laws. This is going to be a huge undertaking to do, and it's going to really slow down. It's going to really slow down the process. Articles could only be amended with the consent of all states. So in order to make any amendment, every single state in the Union had to agree. It's not going to work. Articles could only be... There was no separate executive branch to enforce acts of Congress. So the federal government could say what was legal, but they really didn't have any way to actually carry out or enforce that law. And there was no system of federal courts. So these are all going to be major issues that face the country under the Articles of Confederation. Economic weaknesses. Under the Articles, the federal Congress could not establish a common currency, nor could it regulate interstate commerce or levy taxes. For financial support, the Congress relied solely on contributions from the states, which were unreliable. The Congress could do nothing to compel states to pay their share. Without money, the federal government could not pay its immense war debts. Between 1781 and 1786, the Congress received only 1/6 of what it requested from the states. By 1786, it needed $2.5 million to pay the interest on its debts, but had only $400,000 on hand. The states had bankrupted the nation. To survive, the Congress sought a constitutional amendment to permit a federal 5% duty on imported goods. Twice that amendment failed when a single state balked: Rhode Island in 1782 and New York in 1786. If amending the Articles was so difficult, perhaps only a new constitution could save the Union. American farmers faced hardships such as lower prices for their goods and rising debt in the late 1700s. Growing discontent due to the possibility of foreclosure and a loss of livelihood pushed some farmers to rebel. And we're going to see an episode of that right now with Shays' Rebellion. Meanwhile, a slowdown in the trading of goods increased unemployment in the seaports and reduced the prices paid to farmers for their produce. Without the West Indian market for their shipping, Americans could not pay for their imported manufactured goods. Their debts to British suppliers mounted. In 1785, those suppliers curtailed their credit and demanded payments from the American import merchants. These demands sent a shockwave through the weak American economy as the importers sought to collect from their own debtors in the countryside. Most Americans were farmers, and most farmers were in debt. They lacked the cash to pay their debts on short notice, especially when prices fell for their crops. Losing lawsuits for debt, they faced the loss of their crops, livestock, and even their farms to foreclosure. So we're seeing that this is a major problem here. They don't have the money to pay. They may want to pay, they may have every intention to pay, but they simply do not have that money. And due to the weakness of the government and everything, it's making it very difficult for these farmers to make any money. In western Massachusetts in 1786, farmers took up arms to shut down the courts to block any foreclosure hearings. Farmers did not want to lose their property or go to prison, but they could not pay the higher taxes imposed by the Massachusetts government. Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, became a leader among the farmers. In 1787, he led about 1,000 farmers to seize weapons from the Springfield Armory and attempted to shut down the courts. The elected leaders of Massachusetts insisted that the new republic could not survive if people violently interfered with the courts. In eastern Massachusetts, the state raised an army which marched west to suppress what became known as Shays' Rebellion. Now, Shays' Rebellion is going to affect early government in a major way. Most other states avoided rebellion by satisfying their debtors with relief measures. Some states suspended lawsuits for debt until the Depression lifted. More common were state laws to flood the money supply with paper money. Paper money made it easier for debtors to pay while reducing the value that creditors could collect. Naturally, what relieved the debtors infuriated their creditors, who felt cheated. Creditors blamed the relief measures on excessive democracy. They saw the state governments as too responsive to the opinion of the public, which wanted debtor relief. James Madison agreed liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as by the abuses of power. Some thought of abandoning republicanism in favor of an American monarchy, but most hoped to save the republic by establishing a stronger national government. This stronger government would be capable of controlling the states whenever they threatened commercial property. So, Shays' rebellion is going to lead in part to the creating of the Constitution. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you know how to go get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.